Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by Language Disorder Australia. I'd like to start this presentation by acknowledging the Turrbal and the Jagera people of this land, the traditional custodians of the land of which we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Now, our topic today is supporting EALD students, and that is students with English as an additional language or dialect. And this is relevant to education staff, allied health professionals, and other professionals supporting young kids in this area. Now, this webinar will be recorded and it will be made available on our website within the next couple of business days. Now, any questions you have, you're welcome to type that in the chat box, but otherwise we will have hopefully a few minutes of allocated question time right at the end of this webinar. Now, Language Disorder Australia is a non-for-profit organisation based in Brisbane and Townsville. We have a couple of different branches to our organisation, including Mansell College, previously known as the Glenleighden School, and that is a school that supports prep to Year 12 students who have language disorder as their primary difficulty. Now, the other branches of the organisation include our school support services as well as our Bright Door clinics. Now, our Bright Door clinics are based here at Fig Tree Pocket, in Toowong, and of course in Townsville. With our Bright Door clinics, we have speech pathology, occupational therapy, music therapy, and psychology services. Now, just to further elaborate on school support services, this is a free service for eligible schools in Queensland. And of course, we are able to provide this free service, including our webinars that we run, and that is through the SDSS and NSSNOP funding. Now, with our school support services, we're able to provide services all across Queensland to eligible schools and students. And of course, these schools can be rural, remote, or metro, and across all sectors. So public schools, Catholic education schools, and independent private schools. Now, with our specialist multidisciplinary team, we are able to develop individualised approaches in supporting a variety of students, mostly those who are verified within the school system. So whether it's students who have ASD or ID or SLI, HI, PI, may also include VI, and students with social emotional disorders who also present with language disorder or related difficulties. Now, to find out more about our service of school support services, please have a look under our website on our services, and please feel free to reach out via email or phone. Now, to start off, my name is Athena. I'm a senior speech language pathologist. I'm also the allied health coordinator for the school support services team. Now, I've been a practicing speechy for approximately 8 years now, and I did start my early career in private practice working with paediatric clients. Now, much of my work has also involved working in a transdisciplinary team and supporting students in accessing the curriculum, especially those with language disorder or related difficulties. Now, another favourite area in my role is supporting students with social emotional needs and also students with EALD backgrounds. And now I have a special interest in this area because I'm actually bilingual, come from a Greek cultural background. So this is why this area is quite important to me, especially when I'm tying it in with the students that we work with here at Language Disorder Australia. So those students with language disorder and related needs. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today for our EALD populations, I have drawn a little bit of that from my own experiences and have tied it in with a lot of the research and some of the most common recommendations that we often make to schools in supporting this population. Now, I'll let Liz introduce herself, who's here with me today.
Hi everyone, my name's Liz. I'm a senior speech pathologist here at Language Disorder Australia, and I'm monolingual. So I began my journey as a speech pathologist working in private practice in paediatrics, and then I transitioned into the more consultative role of school support services. So currently I have the pleasure of working both in the school support services branch of the organisation and then also at the Toowong Bright Door Clinic. So, as part of the school support services team, I get to travel around the state and work with principals, learning support teachers, and classroom teachers as well in supporting their students who have language disorder. I really enjoy the opportunities that I have to deliver professional development and also capacity building services as well. And then in my role at Bright Door to Wong, I get to work more directly with clients and their families to achieve their individual speech pathology intervention goals. So, in today's webinar, we're going to cover just exactly who our EALD population is, some considerations around EALD communication and the development of multilingualism, and strategies to support EALD students in the classroom, including those with language disorder. So, what we're going to do first today is if you've got a paper and pen with you, I'm going to pass over to Athena, and we'd like you to step into the shoes of an EALD student and really experience what the classroom is like from their perspective. So I'll pass back over to Athena.
Thank you, Liz. Now, to start off with, I'm going to give you, whoops, not the answers, hopefully. I'm going to give you some very clear instructions. I'm just going to be looking on the side to my other screen over here. So my first instruction that I want to give everyone is I want you to draw a large spiti. And on that large spiti, I want you to draw 2 parathera, 1 on each side. Pretty easy instruction. I'll repeat that one again. So draw a large spiti with 2 parathera, 1 parathera on each side. Next, I want you to add a puerta to your spiti. So add a puerta to your spiti. Pretty simple instruction. And now for the final step, so let's add an isoflower on the right side of your spiti. So an isoflower on the right side of your spiti. Now, I'm going to take a stab in the dark here, and I'm going to assume that most people had a few issues completing this. So this is my answer sheet over here. What I've done is I've highlighted all the words that I assumed that most people wouldn't know, and that's because I've pinched those words from other languages, including some in Greek. So this is the product that I wanted you to end up with, and I'm going to guess that that's not what you've ended up with. And even though you did understand the majority of those words, because the majority of those are not highlighted words, you knew those, you could see that you had a lot of difficulties following those instructions because you were missing a lot of those key words. And this is what can happen in our classrooms, whether our children have a language disorder or maybe be coming from an EALD background, or maybe they're a bit of a combination of both of those areas. So I guess our instructions that we give students can really trip them up at times, even if they just don't know a few of those words. Now, can you imagine if I had delivered that whole activity in Greek? So let's say you're a student and you've just entered Greek school, and all you can hear is ζωγραφίστε ένα μεγάλο σπίτι με 2 παράθυρα. Μετά θέλω να ζωγραφίσετε ένα μεγάλο λουλούδι έξω από το σπίτι. So comparing that first activity to this next set of instructions, again, we need to consider that when looking at our classroom and the level of English that our students may or may not know. Now, to go into our learning for today, who are our EALD learners? Now, oftentimes when we kind of pose that question to many of our schools or many of the people we work with, oftentimes we have this association that EALD is automatically kind of associated with migration, and that's not always the case. To some people, EALD might mean that specialist teaching, so that ESL kind of support and supporting kids in developing their English skills, especially those academic English skills. Now, some people might use this more around that collecting and data analysis, especially if this could lead to potential funding for some of our students. Some teachers acknowledge that EALD students may already be speaking, reading, or writing in another language already, or maybe multiple other languages already. Now, according to the definition by the Department of Education, they say to us that EALD students are those whose first language is a language or dialect other than English, and who may require additional support to assist them in developing proficiency in standard Australian English. And we are going with standard Australian English because that's typically what we would see in an Australian English classroom. That's the language of instruction. Now, if we break down this EALD term further, we can see this actually captures quite a few subcategories and I guess groups into this general kind of umbrella term. So we can see that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students fall into this category as well. Our students who have migrated to Australia, our students that come from a humanitarian or refugee background, children born in Australia but may come from a different cultural background, or maybe speaking another language or a number of other languages at home. Now, our children born to deaf parents, or for kids who are deaf themselves, and maybe users of Auslan, that category of Auslan also falls under EALD. Our international students may also come under this category. And like I said, this list isn't exhaustive. So this is just some examples of some kind of categories that we may come across every day. Now, we need to acknowledge that with our EALD students, our students are bringing a variety of language diversity to our schools. Now, this may include some Aboriginal English, standard Australian English, non-standard Australian English, any traditional Aboriginal languages, community languages such as Chinese, Vietnamese, Greek, etc. And we might also see Creoles or Pidgin languages as well in classrooms. Now, out of curiosity, I would like people, if you can, to type in the text box or the chat box, how many languages or what languages do you know that your students speak at school or at home? I'm curious.
I can imagine that we're going to get a pretty big range of responses. I once went to a Brisbane metropolitan school and the staff told me that they had 63 different languages spoken within their senior cohort, which is just incredible.
That is a very big, what a diverse school that must have been, Liz. Okay, so we're getting a few answers come through. So Vietnamese and Arabic mainly. Yep. Spanish. Oh, yes, Spanish. I can imagine. A lot of schools do Spanish as their LOTE subject as well. Hindi, yeah. Yep. I'm kind of seeing if this kind of falls in with our data on the next slide on which languages are spoken in Australia. So we'll see if that is captured. Oh, Greek, yes. Italian, Vietnamese, Mandarin, Cantonese, Thai, Samoan, yep. Korean, Afrikaans, yes. We've had a few people join us here at Language Disorder Australia who actually speak Afrikaans. Very interesting. Somali as well. Beautiful. Thanks everyone for contributing to that discussion. That's really nice to see. Now let me get back to my PowerPoint screen. Beautiful. So let's have a look at this data further. And what I've done is I've used some of the data coming from the surveys, the census surveys that went out a couple of years ago, I believe. So based on the census data from 2011 to 2016 to 2021, we can kind of see that there's been a steady increase in percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. So you can see that with each census there's been an increase. Now we're kind of saying that almost 813,000 individuals identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Now, from those individuals, most identify as Aboriginal, so kind of sitting on that 91.4%. 4.2% identify as Torres Strait Islanders, and 4.4% identify as both. Now, when we break that down further, and when we're looking at the languages spoken by these populations of people, we can see that 167 languages are spoken by almost 77,000 people, most being the Arnhem Land and Daly River region languages, and we have about 12% of Torres Strait Islander languages as well. Now, when we're looking at multiculturalism in Australia, sometimes it's hard to see how multicultural we actually are. So let's have a look at some of the stats on first, second, and third generation plus Australians. Now we can see that our first generation Australians, and that's defined by the people who moved from overseas but were born overseas, and have then migrated to Australia, we can see that that's 29.3%. Our second generation Australians, on the other hand, are sitting on 22.2%. And those people were born in Australia, but one or both of their parents were born overseas. So we can actually see from this graph that most Australians are actually first and second generation Australians. And I guess less than 50% are that third generation plus Australians. So that's a really interesting statistic that we found there. Now, in terms of our multicultural communities across Australia, so again, some interesting data here, and I've used a bit of a world map there to capture that data. There has been significant growth in a number of communities. The highest has been our Nepalese communities. So we're sitting on a 124% increase, followed by Indian communities on 48%, Pakistani communities 45%, Iraqi communities 38%, and our Filipino communities a rise of 26% since the latest data. Now, in terms of the languages that we speak in our Australian communities, you can see the 5 top winners there, which of course are Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Punjabi. So whoever answered Punjabi before, that falls into this data, and definitely the Cantonese and Vietnamese as well. Also interesting to note here that we also have had a significant jump with our Nepali languages as well. So the states of ACT and Tasmania are sitting on 1.3% of use of that language. Now, looking at our users of Auslan, which of course is very different to Australian or spoken Australian English, because Auslan follows its own sentence order and grammar. So it's kind of incorrect to think it's a direct translation of spoken English. Now, unfortunately, the data previously gathered on Auslan use hasn't been the best because the previous censuses didn't actually have a question directly asking about Auslan. So instead, what it encouraged users to do, or people participating in the census data, was that you had to list a language other, so selecting the box other and then adding in Auslan. So if our users of that didn't add that in, unfortunately, that data wouldn't have been captured. So I feel like this number is probably lower than what it actually could be. But in 2021, we're saying that there's approximately 16,000 users of Auslan who were officially reported. Now, you might be thinking that in your current role as a teacher or as a speech pathologist or any other professional, really, you haven't happened to come across a lot of EALD populations, especially those from a humanitarian migrant background. But I'm guessing this data is probably going to interest you a lot because we're actually experiencing the highest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War, which I find quite a shocking statistic, to be honest. We have approximately 80 million displaced individuals globally right as we speak, and this is because of poverty, war, and persecution. Now, and like I said, this has been the highest statistic since World War II. So it's very likely that if you haven't already, you're probably going to be in contact or be working with somebody from this kind of background. Now, some considerations around EALD communication, some of this you might already know or heard about before, so hopefully consolidating a little bit of that for people. Now, what is very hard for people to sometimes understand is that when I know multiple other languages, it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily using English and just translating that word for word into another language. So if it was that simple, language learning would be much, much easier. So what we're saying is word-to-word translation is often inaccurate. And I'll give you a bit of an example of this, or a couple of examples, I should say. So let's say I have my first sentence here, I had a sleep. Now, if I translate directly that verb had into another language, maybe I don't get the correct meaning of the verb had. So maybe I'm translating it to I own a sleep. What does that actually mean? Another example that I've come across is when particular restaurants have maybe tried to use Google Translator to kind of translate some of their menus and content. So you can see an example of a menu here that says fried milk, kid sandwiches. We've got roast cow and boiled sheep. So that doesn't sound very appetizing to me. Another example I have here is I want a turn. Let's say I'm playing a game. But if I again translate the word turn into another language, I've used a Greek example here. I've written "Θέλω μια στροφή," which literally then in English means I want a twist or a turn. So again, that sentence does not make any sense. So that word-to-word translation is leading us to become lost in translation. Now, I'm going to quickly talk about multi-language acquisition. So with this, you may have heard of the terms simultaneous and sequential language learning. Now, with our simultaneous language learning, that is when typically two or maybe more languages are regularly spoken in the home environment. Let's say that the parents speak Spanish at home, but English is the language used at daycare or in the community. Or other students may speak a different first language. Either example works. All good, yep. So when we're looking at that language 1 acquisition and language 2 acquisition for our simultaneous learners, that happens before the age of 3. So maybe we've started learning language 1 from birth up until age 2. And then after age 2, we might add another language. Now, in terms of our successive language learners, sorry, we're just having some technical difficulties.
Just bear with us. All right, looks like our audio is all good to go. We will have our camera sorted out, but we'll just keep going with our audio because I know that you guys can all see our screens still. All right. All right.
Oh, sorry about that, everyone. That threw me off a little bit. Now, when we're talking about successive language acquisition, that's when our students have already established a language 1. And what happens is a second or third language is introduced anytime after the age of 3. So this may be our children, for example, let's say they come from a Persian-speaking household, and then once they start kindy in, at age 3 or childcare, for example, maybe that's their first official exposure to English. So we'd call them successive multilinguals. Now, generally speaking, we see that our monolingual and multilingual children follow similar acquisition of communication milestones. So we shouldn't notice any major differences there. Of course, there'll be some smaller differences, but overall, we're saying that communication milestones should be the same. Now, the next thing that really applies to multilingual language development is the BICS and the CALP domains. Now, BICS stands for our basic interpersonal communication skills, and that's when we establish language in the first few years. So when I'm learning a language, my BICS would typically take 6 months to 2 years to develop. And that's a lot of that social language acquisition, that day-to-day language and easier kind of vocabulary that I might use. So for our learners, they really need to kind of establish their BICS before we can dive into their CALP. Now, CALP stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, and that is the academic language acquisition, and that would often come through schooling. And our CALP could often take 5 to 7 years to develop in order for us to see functional, on par development with monolingual peers. So that can take quite some time. Now, when we look at the iceberg model by comparing our BICS to our CALP, we can kind of see over here that BICS is very much what we can see on the surface. It is that knowledge, it's the comprehension, it's that application of those basic language skills. It's the way we pronunciate something, the grammar that we use, and the vocab that goes with it. So those factors are immediately apparent. I can have a conversation with someone and I can kind of generally get a bit of a sense of their grammar and their vocab. CALP, on the other hand, is what lies below the surface. So it's that analysis, the synthesis, the evaluation. So all those higher cognitive language functions that come in that academic space. In terms of language one versus language two, these can look exactly the same across languages, but maybe not always. Maybe for some kids, they've developed their BICS in L1 and their CALP in L1, but maybe with their second language, let's say it's English, maybe they're still at developing their BICS skills. Therefore, they still have a lot to go in terms of that academic CALP language. Now, some biases, unfortunately, that do come with that smaller category of our EALD population, which is our English second language individuals. Oftentimes, there are a lot of conscious or unconscious biases that these individuals feel. One of the things that was mentioned in the literature a little bit and people's personal experiences that they were sharing online was what is called the silencing effect. And this is when we get that isolation and exclusion because people feel that if they speak in an accent and they don't sound like a fluent English user, that maybe their ideas and opinions aren't as valued compared to their monolingual peers. Now, there have been some interesting research articles that have come out as well that look at comparing a monolingual to a bilingual speaker and different statements made by each of them. So the data showed that people were more likely to believe somebody who speaks in a fluent English accent as opposed to somebody who's an ESL speaker. So I thought that was quite interesting. And of course, this would lead to things like the linguistic imperialism that is often discussed in the literature as well. And it is a form of a microaggression or even sometimes racism, unfortunately. So we need to remember that oftentimes, even though in Australia we kind of think, oh, yeah, we speak English in Australia, and a lot of people may be monolinguals. We are actually the exception in Australia. Most other countries are bilinguals, and even 70% of the world's population are multilingual individuals. So think of it like this: monolingualism is the exception on a global scale, whereas bilingualism is the rule. Now, some common myths that we have come across, unfortunately. So I'm going to try and bust these myths as I go and kind of give some suggestions as to why these are incorrect. Now, the first one says, if you want to support Anna's English skills, just speak English at home and not Italian. So this is definitely not true. We can see that any language learning benefits can be seen in language one or language two. So there's really good evidence to say that developing skills in language one often has a positive impact on language two. And the other thing to consider here as well is that if Anna's parents aren't fluent in English and maybe they don't feel that English is their best language, perhaps English isn't appropriate for the household context. Maybe we would recommend to them to continue to speak in the language, whatever that may be, the language that they're most comfortable in, because that will ensure that Anna's getting the best language models. Now, another myth that we've come across is exposing children to other languages causes confusion. Just pick one. And again, we can consider this myth busted because we know there are so many benefits to children learning multiple languages. Because we know children are more likely to understand different cultures, be more accepting of others. They develop different ways of thinking. So you have stronger problem solving skills and overall executive functioning skills. Of course, there may be some differences between them and their monolingual peers, but overall, the more languages we know, the better the cognitive benefits and the gains. Now, another myth that we've come across is if you choose to speak both of your languages at home, use the one parent, one language rule. And of course, we no longer recommend this. This is a bit of an outdated recommendation. We used to say this, but we don't necessarily feel like the evidence suggests this anymore. So basically, we do encourage code switching. So if you've started speaking in one language mid-sentence, you feel like going to Cantonese, for example, you can do that. There's no reason why we can't be flexible with our language skills. And also, there's absolutely no reason anymore to implement those strict rules of one parent, one language. You should be able to express yourself in the language that you feel the most comfortable in, and whatever language suits the situation and you want to share with your child. Now, another statement we've come across is, do they really need support? They were born in Australia, they speak fine. Now, so many points come to mind with this statement. So, first of all, what classifies speaking fine? So, do they mean that the child is speaking language one and language two okay on the surface? So, maybe those big skills are looking pretty okay, but maybe underneath those CALP, those academic skills need a little bit more work, or maybe there's some small gaps that need filling. So, just by looking at those, big skills, we can't really draw those conclusions. The other thing is as well, we would really need to consider the years of English spoken. So, for example, if they haven't been speaking English for that many years at all, then maybe they do need more support. If, however, they are speaking English in their home and it is one of their first languages, maybe they don't need as much support, but that's something that you really need to look in and really compare that BICS to the CALP. Now, another statement we've come across is that Indigenous children should never be identified as having a language disorder. It is always a language difference. And again, this is completely not true, whether it is we're talking about an Indigenous child or another EALD child, because we know you can, of course, there are language differences, but you can also have a language disorder. It just makes identifying a language disorder a little bit more tricky when you have someone coming from an EALD background. Now, another myth that we've frequently come across a bit too often for my liking is that, what is the point? They have DLD. They cannot learn their native language, just stick to English. And again, this is an incorrect statement. We know for fact that DLD children will develop other language skills and do become successful multilingual individuals. And because they do have those language difficulties, it may take them a little bit longer, but generally there's no reason why we would make that recommendation of sticking just to English. And again, we're encouraging parents to stick to their best languages, whatever language that may be. Of course, by saying to parents and to students to focus on English and to not look at their first language and cutting that out, that is also quite an unethical statement for us to be making, and it's quite discriminatory as well. So we don't want to erase that cultural or linguistic identity for that child. Now, in terms of a language difference versus a language disorder, like I said, this is an area that can be hard to work out. Now, what constitutes a language difference is that we're looking at a language style that is rule governed and differs from the standard mainstream culture and usage. So you might see, a population of Greek people who kind of speak in a similar way. Maybe it's not grammatically perfect, but they all follow a similarly governed system. So typically we would say that's a language difference. And oftentimes that is because they're following maybe a grammatical Greek rule and they're using that word to word translation. So maybe that's why that meaning can sometimes be a little bit lost in English. On the other hand, when we're talking about a language disorder, that is when we have a significant discrepancy between our language skills relatively for what is expected for that age or development. Now, a bilingual child's language deviates from norms and expectations of their home community, and we would often observe in children with a language disorder that their language difficulties would be across all their languages. Now, Dr. Elizabeth Pena also tells us talks about the complexities of diagnosing a language disorder in EALD populations. And she says, in the early stages of bilingualism, children's language skills are in flux. So there's a huge range of proficiency in their second language performance. Children from a linguistically diverse background are often over or under identified with a language disorder. So, one of the hallmark features that Dr. Elizabeth Pena tells us about is that EALD students with developmental language disorder are challenged in both languages and also have persistent grammatical difficulties. That's one of kind of more the hallmark features of the disorder. Now, we can have various patterns of errors, whether that's more relating to grammar, to vocabulary, to listening, reading comprehension, narrative, any of those things. And of course, those patterns of errors can depend on languages that those students know. And because oftentimes what they're doing is they're trying to apply those grammatical rules or rules of that language to the next language, and oftentimes that doesn't work. Now, when we're looking at the students in terms of what they know, we really need to consider all their languages. If we just consider their English or maybe just their Mandarin, for example, they may appear delayed when in fact they're not. So we really need to look at their combined knowledge across their languages. And again, if there are errors only in one language, this is then a difference, not a disorder. And this can be related to a variety of factors. Maybe they haven't had as much exposure in one language, maybe English has taken over. There's all sorts of things. It might be the own students' motivations in that area. Our EALD students with DLD are more likely to make language errors in comparison to EALD students without a language disorder. So that's also important to note. Now, for the speeches joining us today, I just have a very quick slide on some assessments. So again, some of this information you might know, but I've tried to consolidate that a little bit. We know that standardized formal assessment is not usually recommended, and that's because that our standardized formal assessment isn't normed to these populations that we're working with. So we really need to consider what students know in their other languages and also looking at those dialectal differences. So what might be captured as an error on a standardized assessment may be a bit of a difference in their speech or language system that's typical for their particular dialect. So again, that would be we'd be missing a lot of information if we just went to drawing the conclusion that they have a language disorder based on those errors. Now, what we do recommend, on the other hand, is that we carry out a language history and we investigate the language dominance. So the languages used across environments, who they speak those languages with, in what context, and for how long. The other thing we really need to look at is that composite scoring. So looking at their combined language 1 and language 2 vocabulary, and compare that data to a monolingual peer. And again, we're taking both languages or all languages into account in order to then compare to the monolingual peer. Dynamic assessment also really works well for EALD populations, and that's when, of course, we use the test-retest model. Sorry, the test, teach, retest model, because that's going to give us a good indication on that particular student's language learning ability. Now, for younger children, if you have any really young kids on your caseloads, 12 to 30 months roughly, you can use the AUSI SF assessment, and that is the infant vocabulary checklist. And that's a nice little checklist you can use with parents as well to really evaluate the language skills of our EALD populations. Now, for our Indigenous students, oral narrative assessments are typically good to use because we can actually compare that data quite solidly to our non-Indigenous students. Whereas vocab, on the other hand, isn't the most reliable indicator. So definitely go a narrative if you can. The Gomerri language assessment also by Tara Lewis is also another appropriate language assessment to use for our Indigenous students. So definitely look into that as well. Now, I'm going to pass you on to Liz, and Liz is going to talk about some strategies to support EALD students.
Thank you, Athena. Okie dokie. So, some people might think that there are not too many classrooms, or you might not have come across many students who you think that these will apply to. However, remember the stats from Athena's section of the webinar. So approximately 1 in 4 students in Australia is EALD. So that's a quarter of your classroom. And some people might also incorrectly assume that supporting students who are from an EALD background, it's only the role of ESL teachers or only the role of learning support teachers. But that's just not the case. It comes down to the whole school community to provide that support, because we know that EALD students are going to need that targeted, systematic, and explicit instruction to be able to access and succeed in curriculum tasks. Now, regardless of EALD status, we know that students all have their unique profile of strengths, interests, and challenges. With EALD students, we have to also consider their level of English learning before they step into your classroom. And we need to adjust our instructions, our materials, but also our expectations as well. Now, Australia is a wonderfully multicultural society, so embrace that in your classroom. Allow your EALD students to lead an activity in their first language. So they could share a song, a poem, a folk tale, or they could teach their class about the importance of a cultural holiday. And that can be a really empowering change for a student, because instead of feeling like they're always playing catch up in English, instead they get to be a leader in a language that they're confident in and about a culture that they're proud of as well. So it's really helpful to make use of multilingual resources like books, games, and videos. And at the end of the webinar, I'll link you to some really cool online sites. You could have a map in your classroom with pins to represent each student's heritage. And each time, a little bit of time each week, you could, as a whole class, learn some things about those sites. So you could do some research about those countries. You could learn things like their capital cities, their cultural sites, even their national dish. And as part of that, you could learn key greetings in your EALD student's language. And you could have the student teach you and your peers those greetings. And then the next day at roll call, each student could answer in those greetings. And Harmony Week events are also a great opportunity for schools as a whole to celebrate diversity and multiculturalism. The next thing to consider is translation, and Athena has touched on this a little bit as well. Now, as a monolingual clinician, something that can really trip us up is translation errors when we try to translate word for word. So that's that translating something word by word into another language without really considering the whole meaning of what you're trying to say. Now, I will have a disclaimer, translation apps and software have come in leaps and bounds recently, but it is something to be aware of. So if you translate a sentence back and forth between 2 languages, you'll watch it get further and further from your original message until it ends up usually pretty nonsensical. So what is functional is word for word translation. So this is where even when a translation doesn't match the exact structure of the original sentence, the intended meaning is conveyed. So this is where pre-made translated resources are really, really valuable, not to mention any bilingual staff members you might have on your team. Now, translanguaging or code switching refers to multilinguals using their resources across languages together without thinking of those language boundaries. So not thinking, okay, I'm going to say this in English versus I'm going to say this in Arabic. So this leads overall to a more efficient and successful communication. Now I'm going to pass to Athena just for a minute, because could you please give us an example of code switching?
I sure can. So let's see what I can come up with on the spot here. So for example, I would use code switching when talking with my family at home usually. So I might start a sentence in English and say, hey, I did a webinar today on language disorder. And from those people, we got a lot of responses. So we can, you can see I'm kind of mixing up some words and phrases in there.
Exactly that. So Athena's used both of her languages together there, and translating involves using elements of those multiple languages together to effectively communicate. So students are likely to use translanguaging to support their vocab, follow instructions, process a text or video, communicate ideas, and express their needs as well. Now, transacquisition, on the other hand, is a pedagogy that refers to using translanguaging to support academic language development and concept development. Now, this supports accelerated curriculum learning because all the languages are working together for the strongest result. So, perhaps in the classroom, this could look like your students moving between multiple different languages at different stages of an assignment. So, in that discussing, brainstorming, kind of that think, pair, share stage, they might be using multiple languages. Also, they might be using their more confident language for drafting and revising. And then they could be supported to use standard Australian English for their final draft of an assignment because that's what it's going to be submitted and graded in. Now, translanguaging and transacquisition are supportive of students accessing the curriculum because they've got the benefit of using the language that they're most confident in to support their learning in the other language. So, ways that you can support learning in all languages include modifying assessment and homework pieces. So, you could include more examples of visuals, provide a glossary of terms in student friendly language in English, but you could also provide a translated glossary as well. Now, if you can access a reliable translation, provide copies of activities in both languages. And because then they've got the opportunity to compare between them, and they can also take them home to discuss with their parents in their home language as well, which involves their parents and their families too. Outside of curriculum tasks, it's really important that students who are learning English are able to functionally communicate their everyday needs. So, this comes under that BICS component of language that Athena was talking about. So, that's the everyday communication skills. For EALD students who've just begun to learn English, it's really important to check in with them to make sure they could ask for the important things they need. So, food and drink, to go to the bathroom, asking for help. They could even have a visual for these. If they don't have the words in English, you could have a visual that you could use, like a keychain or even in their pencil case. And that can be really helpful if they're working with staff who might not be as familiar with them and they need to communicate those things in a pinch. Now, vocabulary learning is a key part of learning a new language, and a key part of learning vocab is repetition. So we know that typically developing monolingual students generally need 6 to 14 repetitions of new words before they've got them stored and they can access and use them accurately. Now, students learning English have so much vocab to learn. So consider prioritizing the most essential vocabulary for your curriculum topic. So a way that you could do this would be to list out all of the kind of the key curriculum vocab in that topic and categorize it. So split them up into groups of essential, standard, and extended. So your essential vocab are 10 or so words that are absolutely critical for the student to comprehend that subject. Standard words add a little bit more detail and information, and your extended words are your higher level vocab that add on more complex information. And for your students who are just learning English, prioritizing learning that essential vocabulary is going to give them the most bang for their buck when it comes to accessing and understanding that content. In line with that essential vocabulary, you can explicitly teach your students how to identify and use those keywords, which is going to be really helpful in research activities and using search engines. And provide frequent opportunities for your students to practice their new vocabulary and also teach them strategies for understanding that unfamiliar vocabulary because they're going to be coming across so many new words. So, strategies like teaching them how to draw on context clues or even just where to find definitions either in English or in their home language. And here's where you can really encourage that translanguaging or code switching as well. You want to let them draw on their first language to learn in their second. Ways to make language learning accessible include fostering a positive relationship with your EALD students and their families. Now, as we mentioned before, we want learning to be occurring across all of the students' languages. So incorporate the different languages that are represented in your classroom into your activities. Now, and remember, going off the stats that Athena shared as well, you are very likely to have students speaking multiple different languages within your class too. And remember that language learning occurs across all curriculum subjects, not just in English or in LOTE classes, because every period is an opportunity to be teaching vocabulary, correct sentence structure, and also appropriate social skills. The use of multiple modalities to convey information is also really helpful here. You want to be using lots of visuals and videos to supplement your auditory information. And you might also initially consider adapting your students' response methods to be more verbal rather than written, while they learn that written kind of component of English as well. Also consider your delivery of verbal information. In particular, be sure to emphasize the keywords in your content. Don't speak too fast. And remember to face the students and not the board when you're talking. Even if you turn around to write, turn back to face the students to talk. Now, learning a new language, and particularly academic content in a new language, takes time and a lot of energy from all involved. Students are going to need lots of opportunities to practice, and they also need to receive specific feedback from you. So, what they said correctly, what needed to change, how they should fix it up. You'll probably also need to support them in oral interactions as well, and that can include social interactions like greetings and asking specific questions. And also, if you know that you're going to go around your classroom and ask all of your students what they did on the weekend, you might spend a minute beforehand checking in with your EALD students, brainstorming with them and rehearsing what they're going to say when it's their turn. Remember that language-heavy tasks can be overwhelming, so break them down into more manageable chunks and provide the student with one part at a time, incorporating visuals and multilingual versions where possible. And depending on your student's level of English exposure and use, you're probably also going to have to teach English language features in detail. So that could be the meaning of prefixes and suffixes, as well as structural rules, like in English, generally the adjectives precede the noun that they describe, and so on. And finally, language is learnt most functionally in context, so make things tangible and useful. If you're learning about money in math, have them practice ordering something at the tuck shop and receiving change. Or if you're learning persuasive text writing, maybe they could practice persuading their parents to let them go to a specific social event. Now, in the essence of time, I'm not going to go into specific strategies relating to vocab building and oral narrative. Instead, I really encourage you to check out some of our previously recorded webinars that we've got on the screen there. And you can find these under our professional learning tab on our website under SALDA Legacy Webinars. Now, the strategies in these webinars aren't specifically allocated just for EALD students. They're for supporting all students and students with language disorder as well, because we know that EALD students are going to need that explicit support in building that vocabulary and oral language skills. Now, another webinar that will be suitable for staff supporting EALD students will be the sentence structure webinar. So stay tuned. Athena and I will be presenting that in a couple of weeks' time. And this webinar is going to be particularly helpful for supporting students who are struggling with their sentence structure in English and need that explicit teaching in this area. So you can register for that one on our website, and these are all freely available on our website too. Now, as Athena mentioned earlier, worldwide, we're currently experiencing the highest level of international displacement on record as humans flee from persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. Students from refugee backgrounds might also have experienced significant hardship and trauma. And so it's important to be aware of how trauma can impact a child's development in the physical, mental, communication, and in the social emotional domains. In addition to this, refugee children are likely to have experienced interruptions to their schooling, or it's possible that they might be coming into a formal classroom environment for the first time when they arrive in Australia. So trauma-informed teaching practices are essential, and that includes building your own knowledge and understanding of the nature and impacts of trauma, helping to shift perspectives relating to trauma, and also self-care to support the health and well-being of staff who are supporting children who've experienced trauma. Now, there is targeted support available for schools to assist them in supporting their students from refugee backgrounds. So Education Queensland has created a refugee student support kit, and that's a comprehensive list of resources relating to information about refugees, links to practical resources for teachers, counsellors, and school groups as well. And the majority of resources listed in this kit are either free or relatively low cost. And the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority website also has a similar list as well, and that's for supporting EALD students in general. On the list as well is the QPAST organisation, which is a Queensland-based not-for-profit that provides support and services to people from refugee backgrounds. And one of the services that they offer is tailored trainings for schools. And the Refugee Council of Australia also has links to classroom resources for teachers on their website, and that includes teaching materials, games and resources, and also personal stories from refugees as well. Now, if you have a student who's a recent arrival to Australia and has had that limited exposure to English, so they're right at the start of their English learning journey, technology can be a real asset here. So one really cool feature of PowerPoint is the Microsoft Translator, which can provide translated subtitles while you're presenting PowerPoint slides live. It can link directly to your student's device via a QR code, and it can even learn from the content on your slides to make the translation more accurate. So you simply set the language that you're speaking and the language that you'd like the subtitles to be presented in, so the student can follow along as you speak. The thing here to consider is your student's literacy level in their first language, because they do need to be able to read the subtitles. But regardless, a very cool feature. And now, just to finish off, some nice multilingual language resources that are freely available online. So Global Storybooks portal contains multilingual open license books for over 40 countries and regions. So you could provide your students a copy of a story in both of their languages and have them follow along together. You can see some of the examples I've got there. They're translated between so many languages, and they're also leveled according to difficulty. And the stories from the Global Storybooks portal have all come from the African Storybook Initiative, which is another website that has over 1,000 original stories in over 150 African languages, as well as English, French, and Portuguese too. So on the website, you can read the storybooks there, or you can read them on the app. And registered users on the website can also create, translate, and adapt the stories to suit their needs. Now, that's all the content that we have for you today. What I'm going to do is just pass back to Athena just for some final notes.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. Now, I have a beautiful quote to kind of end this presentation on, and that is kind of looking at making Australia more multilingual and supporting multilingualism being the norm. So I've got a beautiful quote here by Albert Einstein, who says, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking, and it cannot be changed without changing our thinking." So also shout out to my friend Kelly Harrison from Languages Roadshow. She's all about making Australia multilingual and supporting that load space as well for teachers. Now, some quick references that I'll click through that we have used to create our content for today. Please feel free to let me know if you've got any questions, or if you're watching this recorded, you can definitely pause through this. If you do have any questions, we've got a couple of minutes of a bit of time that we can allocate to that right now. Otherwise, I'll also put up the slide over here with our Facebook group information. Please feel free to join this. We do have some nice discussions and sharing of information in that Facebook group. We also have our website there, and if you'd like to contact us directly, use that email on the screen. Now, live attendees of the webinar will receive an email with a link, and through this link, you'll complete a short feedback survey. Now, again, if you're watching the recorded version of this webinar on our website, there is a button there called Webinar Surveys, which will then take you through to the survey form. So please make sure you're selecting the right one. You're selecting supporting EALD students before filling that out. And once that information from the survey is collected, you'll then receive via email your certificate of participation and completion for today's webinar. Please also watch out our Facebook and our Language Disorder Australia website for future webinars. I'm just going to quickly change screens to see if any questions are coming through our chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for your feedback.
I hope that was helpful. And even if it was information you knew already, hopefully that puts everything together. So you're not, looking at so many different resources and articles. We've hopefully combined that information for you. We'll just give everyone a couple more minutes before we say goodbye for today. And please also remember to join us for our next webinar. Liz and I will be getting together again in 2 weeks' time.
All right, we might finish that one there.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And like I said, if you wake up in the middle of the night with any more questions, do feel free to email those through and we'll endeavour to respond to those as soon as we can. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, great evening. Bye.